Okay, well, the story I'm going to tell is called The Selfish King. And it starts like this. Once, a giant castle towered above all the trees that surrounded it. Its shiny walls glimmered in the sunlight. The selfish king who inhabited the castle stood by a window, motionless, staring out into the deep green forest. He possessed all the wealth and power any ruler could ever hope for. But the one thing that he coveted the most, he could not get his greedy hands on. That one thing was the most beautiful bird that the world had ever known. This bird was a dove. It was the color of new fallen snow with delicate shades of moonlight. Its soft black eyes were like rare pearls found in the deepest ocean. The cry that emanated from its mouth was not mournful, but it was soothing and inspiring. It sang of hopes and possibilities. The people of the kingdom loved this bird who lived atop an olive tree in the middle of the forest. Oftentimes they would gather at the foot of the giant tree to listen to the beautiful songs. Parents would hold their children and they listened quietly, reverently. Old people would weep without knowing why. All they knew was that the sight and the sound of this unique creature made them glad they were alive. The king walked away from the window and he slammed his fist on a table and he vowed right then and there that he would own the one thing he did not possess. So then he called his top generals and he promised glory and fame to the one who could bring the bird to the castle. Now the generals looked at each other in disbelief because they knew how much the people loved this beautiful creature. But orders were orders and they had to be followed. So the generals sent out the armies with promises of promotions and medals, and the soldiers went out like a devastating wildfire, destroying everything in their paths. They did not stop until they came to the giant olive tree. Then, methodically, they began to chop it down. Little by little, the mighty tree began to lean and lean and lean until it came crashing down to the forest floor. All the nearby creatures had to flee for their lives. Then the soldiers searched the mangled branches until they came across the stunned dove. One of them picked it up. It gave no resistance. Its eyes were closed and its tiny heart beat weakly and sadly. That soldier ran back to the castle and he gave the king his trophy. Oh, the king was elated, and immediately he placed a gold star on the soldier's chest. He took the dove and he tossed it into a wrought iron cage, locked the cage door, and walked out of the room. Now, the next day, the king returned, and this time the dove was more alert. Its eyes were open, but they were very sad. The king gave the dove some seeds, placed some water in the cage, and sat back in a fancy chair and demanded a song. None came. No matter how much that king screeched and bellowed and hollered, the dove made no sound. That selfish king stormed out of the room. The next day he returned. The results were the same. The dove made no sound. Every day he would return, always the same. Now one day, the selfish king came back to where the bird was, and he noticed something strange. The beautiful white color had disappeared. The dove had turned an ashen, dull gray color, and those once beautiful eyes had taken that cold, dull, lackluster black of the wrought iron cage. The king didn't understand what was happening. The dove looked as if it were dying. Then the king happened to look out the castle window, and he noticed the people of the kingdom were walking around as if in a trance. They were acting peculiar. He ran outside and he wanted to know what was happening. They wouldn't talk to him. They just continued walking. And he noticed that their faces had the same color as the dove, a dull, grayish color. Their eyes were the color of the wrought iron cage. what was happening. He didn't understand, and he noticed a child, perhaps a beggar, leaning against a storefront, and he ran to him, and he demanded, the child tell him what was happening. The child looked up with that colorless face, those eyes that resembled the wrought iron cage, and the child spoke weakly and said, please, let it go. Release it so we may all live. And then the king looked at the store window, and to his horror, he saw that he was just like everybody else. The color had left his face, and his eyes were that cold, dull black of the wrought iron cage. The king ran back to the palace. He went to the room where the cage was, and he opened the cage, and the dove stood there like a statue. But then it began to move slowly. It left the cage, and it lifted its wings as if to fly, but it fell weakly to the floor. The king picked it up gently, and he placed the dove on the sill of an open window. And as soon as the streaks of sunlight hit that bird, its color came back. It was revived. Those eyes began to sparkle and dance in the sunlight. And the dove looked back at the king, whose face was now streaked with tears. And he lifted his wings and took off. And with that, he let out the most beautiful song that king had ever heard. And he disappeared into a patchwork of clouds. Now, in that kingdom, people's hearts were filled with joy and hope, including the king's. And it is said that the king demolished his big castle, and in this place, he planted an olive grove where the dove and all his descendants sing to the people to this day, filling their hearts with peace and hope. That's my story.
Wow.